What if everything you thought was real turned out to be a lie? A betrayal so deep it shattered the life you built. Watch as one man discovers his wife's double life and how his silent revenge changes everything. Can trust ever be rebuilt, or is it too late? Don't miss the shocking twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. What would you do if you were him? Jason Miller sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him, the steam rising in lazy spirals. It had been a quiet morning, too quiet. Rebecca had left earlier than usual, her hurried kiss on his cheek barely noticeable. He tried to push the feeling away, telling himself it was nothing. They had been married for 20 years, of course there would be moments of distance. But today something felt off. He tried to focus on the report in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to Rebecca. Over the past few weeks, he'd noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She'd become more distant, her responses to his questions short, her laughter absent. She used to be the one who'd surprise him with a cup of coffee in the morning, or leave a note in his briefcase to remind him of something important. But now, there was only silence. And tonight, it would be another late night for her, or so she said. Jason didn't like it. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. But the little things, the way she would glance at her phone when he walked into the room, the way she would leave the house and come back later with an excuse that didn't add up, had started to eat at him. He'd never been the jealous type. But now the unease was building inside him, gnawing at the pit of his stomach. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. A text from his colleague, David, about the upcoming campaign pitch. Jason glanced at it briefly but didn't respond. He was distracted again, watching the clock tick. Every second seemed to drag on, as if the silence in the house had taken on a life of its own. As he sipped his coffee, Jason's eyes wandered to the counter. Rebecca's phone lay there, charging. It wasn't unusual for her to leave it unattended, but today something about it felt different. The buzzing stopped, and then came the unmistakable sound of a new notification. Jason hesitated. His hand slowly reached toward the phone. A part of him told him to leave it alone, but curiosity won. He glanced at the screen. Tyler. The name appeared in a message preview. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see that name. Tyler Green, the guy from her work. The guy who had been around a lot lately. Jason remembered the way Rebecca's eyes softened when she talked about him, more than she'd ever talked about anyone at the office. She always played it off as work-related, but Jason had never liked the way Tyler looked at her. "You're still on for dinner tonight, right?" the message from Tyler said with a smiley face at the end. Jason's grip tightened around the phone. He'd never felt more exposed in his life. A million thoughts rushed through his mind. Should he confront her now? Should he ask her who Tyler was, or was this a moment to back away and pretend he hadn't seen anything? His thoughts spun out of control. His breath quickened, and he couldn't shake the cold sense of dread that washed over him. He hadn't planned on feeling this way. He thought he trusted Rebecca. Jason clicked off the phone screen and placed it back on the counter, his pulse racing. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to let it go, but deep down, he knew that the moment he'd seen Tyler's name, things had changed. The connection between them was not just professional. As if sensing his distress, the door opened and Rebecca walked in. She flashed him a quick smile, but Jason noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slight hesitation before she spoke. "Hey," she said, trying to sound normal. "How's your day going?" Jason didn't answer immediately. He studied her, searching her face for something. She seemed different. The warmth he once saw in her eyes wasn't there anymore. Maybe he had imagined it, but something was off. "Fine," Jason said, his voice flat. He looked at the phone again, but this time he didn't reach for it. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, but the seed had been planted, and he knew it would grow. Rebecca walked past him and into the kitchen, busying herself with something. Jason stood up, his heart still racing. He had to know, but for now he had to wait. There would be a time for confronting the truth. As he watched her, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. But how much could he really trust his instincts? Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The lingering sense of unease that had settled in his chest after reading the message from Tyler only grew stronger with each passing hour. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept wandering back to Rebecca and the cryptic conversation that had transpired between her and Tyler. The way she had glanced at her phone, the way she had smiled when she mentioned him. It was all too much. Tonight she'd left the house early, citing another late meeting at work. Jason had heard that excuse before, but this time something felt different. He couldn't help himself. He decided to follow her. The streets of San Diego were bustling, but Jason felt like he was in a bubble, his mind racing as he followed the familiar path Rebecca took every evening. He kept a safe distance, watching her walk into a high-end restaurant he recognized. He had never seen her go there before. The place was upscale, intimate, and not at all where she would typically choose for dinner with a colleague. Jason's heart raced. He parked his car across the street, the headlights dimming as he switched off the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the restaurant. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, that he was overreacting, but deep down he knew. Rebecca had been acting strangely for weeks. The late nights, the sudden absences, the new habits. She had become a stranger to him, slipping further away with each passing day. And now, here she was, walking into a restaurant with Tyler. Jason sat in the car, unable to look away as he saw them through the glass. Rebecca and Tyler sat at a secluded table in the corner, their heads close together, laughing softly at something only they understood. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He had to admit it now. This wasn't just work. This wasn't a colleague. It was something else. Something he wasn't ready to confront, but had no choice but to face. He watched them for what felt like hours, barely able to breathe, before he saw them leave the restaurant. They stood together, their bodies almost touching as they exchanged quiet words before getting into Tyler's car. Jason's stomach twisted in knots. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. The reality of what he was witnessing was sinking in, and it felt like a cold slap to his face. Without thinking, Jason started the car and followed them. He kept a safe distance, the headlights of his car barely visible behind them. His mind raced with a million thoughts. What was he supposed to do? Should he confront them? Should he just go home and pretend nothing had happened? As they reached a quiet neighborhood, Tyler's car slowed and turned into a driveway. Jason parked several houses down, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched from a distance as Tyler and Rebecca got out of the car, talking and laughing as if the world didn't matter. For a brief moment, Jason felt like an intruder in his own life, watching a scene that wasn't meant for him. He couldn't just walk away, not now. He had to know the truth. But what would he do with it? Could he confront Rebecca now, or would he be digging himself into a hole he couldn't climb out of? Rebecca kissed Tyler lightly on the cheek before she turned to walk toward the door of the house. The door clicked shut behind her. Jason sat there, frozen. His mind was spinning. He had seen it with his own eyes, his worst fear confirmed. But what now? What did he do with this knowledge? He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel again. For a long time, he just sat there in the dark, watching the lights in Rebecca's house flicker through the window. His heart was heavy, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The truth was right there, staring him in the face, but he had no idea what it meant for him, or for their marriage. What was he supposed to do now? Jason sat in the living room, his hands shaking as the minutes dragged on. He had come home hours ago, but the scene he had witnessed between Rebecca and Tyler still replayed in his mind like a film on a loop. The laughter, the touch of their hands, the way they seemed so comfortable, so at ease with one another. It all felt like a punch to his gut. Every instinct told him to confront her, but he hesitated. He couldn't keep living in this silent hell of uncertainty. He needed answers, but how could he ask for them? How could he face the woman he had trusted more than anyone in the world and demand the truth? The door clicked open, and Rebecca walked in. Jason stood up, his heart pounding. She didn't notice him at first, too busy with her things, but when she turned and saw him, her eyes immediately darted to the floor. She knew. Jason opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, he couldn't find the strength to speak. Finally, he managed to say, "We need to talk." Rebecca took a deep breath and nodded. She set down her keys and walked toward him, a soft frown forming on her face. Her eyes avoided his, but there was no denying the tension in her shoulders. She knew what was coming. Jason's mind raced, but his voice was steady as he asked, "Who's Tyler?" Her eyes widened slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. "Jason, I saw you," Jason cut in, his voice cold. "At the restaurant, with him, laughing, touching. You think I didn't see it?" Rebecca flinched, but there was no hiding the guilt in her eyes. She dropped her gaze and exhaled sharply. "Jason, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this." "Then why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie?" His voice cracked as the anger and hurt bubbled to the surface. "I've been nothing but loyal to you, and this is what I get in return?" Her shoulders sagged, and she finally met his gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Jason shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "What does that mean, Rebecca? That it just happened? That you fell into his arms and couldn't get out? I've been with you for 20 years. We've built a life together, and now you're telling me it just happened?" The words hung in the air between them like poison. Rebecca stepped back, her face twisting with frustration and sorrow. "Jason, I didn't set out to hurt you, but you've been so distant. I felt alone. Tyler made me feel seen. She stopped herself as though she had said too much. "Alone? Alone?" Jason's voice raised, his body tense with the effort of holding himself back. "You've been my wife for 20 years. I gave you everything, and you still felt alone?" "I didn't mean it like that," Rebecca whispered, a tear escaping down her cheek. "I'm sorry, but Tyler, he was there for me when you weren't. He listened when you didn't. And I got caught up in it." Jason's eyes were burning with a mix of anger, betrayal, and something else, something even more painful. He felt sick to his stomach. "So you let him in, and I was just left in the dust? You threw everything away for someone who was just a temporary fix?" His voice broke on the last words. Rebecca took another step back, wiping her tears. "I'm sorry, Jason. I should have told you sooner. I should have been honest with you." Jason stepped closer to her, his face hard. "And how long did this go on? How many nights did you spend with him? How long have you been lying to me?" Her silence was deafening. Jason could see the way she closed herself off, the way she tried to hold it together. But it was too late. The damage was done. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "How long?" Rebecca took a deep breath. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words heavy with regret. "It's been 6 months, but I never meant to hurt you, Jason. I didn't know how to fix it." Jason staggered backward, his heart sinking. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of deceit, of betrayal. It was too much to bear. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, he walked away, his mind racing. His whole world had turned upside down in a matter of seconds. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he loved, had shattered everything. Jason stood by the window, staring out into the night, feeling the weight of it all crashing down on him. The love they had built, the life they shared, it was all a lie. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face etched with guilt and regret, but Jason couldn't look at her anymore. The man who had trusted her, who had built his life around her, was gone. Jason's voice broke the silence, soft and cold. "I don't know if I can forgive you." The silence in the house felt unbearable. Jason's mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so hollow, so alone. His heart still ached from the confrontation with Rebecca, but the truth, her admission, had only cracked open a much deeper wound. He needed answers, more than what Rebecca had given him. He knew he couldn't let this lie anymore. The past few months of suspicions and questions had been eating at him, but now they were inescapable. The knowledge that everything he had thought to be true was a lie left him numb, yet the need to know more pushed him forward. Jason stood up from the couch, pacing the room. The pain was raw, but it was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the feeling of being a fool, of not seeing the cracks that had been forming around him for so long. The urge to dig deeper was overwhelming. He could still hear Rebecca's voice in his head, the words from their confrontation echoing. 6 months. 6 months of lying. 6 months of hiding the truth. How much else had she kept from him? How far had this affair really gone? Jason moved to the desk where Rebecca usually kept her things. He hesitated for a moment. Was this wrong? Was he crossing a line by going through her things again? The answer seemed obvious. Yes, but he didn't care anymore. He needed the truth. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled open the drawer. Papers, bills, a few old receipts. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then his fingers brushed over something else, an envelope. It was thick, and it didn't look like anything he had seen before. With a deep breath, Jason pulled it out. His stomach tightened as he opened it. Inside there were flight tickets, 2 of them. One for Rebecca, one for Tyler. They were both scheduled for a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin next weekend. The thought struck him hard. It was supposed to be their anniversary weekend. His heart raced as he read the details. They had been planning this trip together for months. All the while, Jason had been under the illusion that Rebecca was just working late, spending time at the office, when in reality she had been making plans to run away with Tyler. Jason felt the blood drain from his face as the truth sank in. 6 months. This wasn't just an affair. It was a deliberate, planned betrayal. He had been living in a house with a stranger. He could barely keep himself composed as he carefully placed the tickets back in the envelope. The anger surged again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just hurt. It was rage, pure and unfiltered. As if on instinct, Jason grabbed his phone and texted Rebecca. "We need to talk, now." He knew that confronting her again wouldn't make him feel any better, but he couldn't let her slip away from the truth this time. He had to confront her with everything. The door opened soon after. Jason didn't look up at first, but he heard her step inside, her heels clicking against the floor. "Jason," Rebecca said, her voice uncertain, as if she knew what was coming. She stood in the doorway, trying to gauge his mood. Jason turned, his jaw tight. He didn't wait for her to speak. "I know about the trip. I know about the cabin, Rebecca." Rebecca froze. Her face went pale, and Jason could see the guilt written all over her. I can explain," she started, but Jason cut her off. "Explain?" He took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "How do you explain planning a weekend getaway with him? Our weekend getaway? How do you explain hiding it from me for so long?" His voice cracked on the last word, and the anger turned into something raw, desperate. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jason," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought maybe if I didn't say anything it would be easier, but it wasn't. I thought I could keep everything together." She shook her head, clearly overwhelmed by her own guilt. Jason's eyes burned. He wanted to scream at her, but instead his voice remained low and icy. 6 months, Rebecca. 6 months of lies. And you're telling me now that you thought you could just keep it all together? Do you have any idea what this has done to me? His words hit her like a slap, but she didn't move. "I never meant to hurt you," Rebecca said, but it sounded hollow, like she was reciting words she had practiced for hours. "I never wanted to fall for him, but he was there, Jason. He listened to me. He made me feel seen, and I lost myself." Jason stared at her, trying to comprehend the depth of her words, trying to process the tangled web of excuses and justifications. The truth was now undeniable. This had been going on for much longer than he had imagined, and the betrayal wasn't just about a one-night affair. It was about a relationship that had been built on lies from the start. For a moment, Jason felt lost. The anger was there, but so was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He wasn't sure how much of the woman standing in front of him was still the woman he married. "Do you even love me anymore?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this, Jason." Jason nodded slowly. The truth was there. It had always been there. But now it felt like everything he had once believed in was shattered beyond repair. Jason couldn't breathe as he paced the kitchen floor. The weight of the revelations from his confrontation with Rebecca was still crushing him. He felt like he was drowning in the tidal wave of lies and deceit, each one more painful than the last. But as much as it hurt, there was something else, something more elusive, a nagging feeling that kept him up at night. It was the silence of everyone around him. He had been so focused on Rebecca and Tyler, so consumed by their betrayal, that he had overlooked the fact that Kimberly, Rebecca's best friend, someone he trusted, had been part of this. How had she stayed silent through it all? Jason knew he couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. The truth, however hard, was all he had left. He grabbed his jacket and walked out of the house, the cold air hitting his face as he walked down the street toward Kimberly's apartment. The journey felt like it took forever. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure what kind of answers he was even looking for. Kimberly had always been a close friend to Rebecca. When Jason and Rebecca first got married, she was the one who stood by her side. Now she was the one who had allowed the affair to continue in plain sight. She had been Rebecca's confidant, her shoulder to cry on when things weren't right in their marriage. Yet she said nothing. Jason's hands tightened around the steering wheel, frustration building inside him. When he arrived at Kimberly's apartment, he didn't bother to knock. He just walked right in. Kimberly was sitting on the couch, her face pale when she saw him standing in the doorway. "Jason, I wasn't expecting you," Kimberly said, standing up quickly. Her voice was uneasy, her posture rigid. Jason could already tell that she knew what was coming. "Sit down," Jason said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and anger. "We need to talk." Kimberly hesitated but eventually sat back down, her eyes avoiding his. Jason could feel the tension between them. He had never thought it would come to this. He had never imagined that the woman he had trusted most, besides Rebecca, would be the one hiding the truth from him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jason asked, the words falling from his mouth like stones. He was angry, but there was also an undeniable sense of betrayal in his voice. Kimberly didn't even flinch at the question, but he saw her bite her lip, a clear sign of discomfort. "I didn't know how to tell you, Jason," Kimberly finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, then looked away, clearly struggling. "I knew about the affair, but Rebecca, she was my friend. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want to be the one to break everything." Jason felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. "So you just let it happen? You knew your best friend was betraying me and you said nothing?" Kimberly's face crumpled in guilt, but she didn't look him in the eye. "I thought maybe she'd stop. I thought maybe it was just a phase, but I knew it wasn't, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't destroy her life." Jason stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You destroyed my life, Kimberly. You let this happen. You watched me suffer and you did nothing. You stood by, pretending like everything was fine. You betrayed me just as much as she did." The anger in Jason's voice echoed through the small apartment. Kimberly winced but stayed silent. She knew he was right. She had let him down. "I'm sorry," Kimberly whispered, barely audible. Her voice cracked as she tried to hold back the tears. "I never wanted this to happen. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't want to lose Rebecca as a friend, and I didn't know how to help you. I didn't know what to say." Jason's anger didn't subside, but he could hear the sincerity in her voice. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, but for a fleeting moment he could almost understand her fear. She had been caught between two worlds, one of loyalty to her friend and the other of loyalty to him, a man she had watched suffer in silence. "But you should have said something," Jason said, his voice softer now, tinged with a deep sadness. "You should have said something before I had to find out the way I did." Kimberly didn't respond, her face wet with tears now. She had no defense. Jason's words cut deeper than anything Rebecca had said. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "Do you know how much it hurt to find out that my best friend, the person I trusted most, had known about the affair and never said a word?" Jason's voice trembled. "That was the hardest part. The silence. knowing that everyone around me was in on this, and I was the last to know. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jason," Kimberly said, her voice barely a whisper, shaking. "I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back." Jason looked at her for a long moment. His heart ached, but the anger was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He wanted to walk away from it all, but this conversation, this truth, was just one more piece of the puzzle he had to fit together. He took a deep breath, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream. "I need some time. I don't know how to look at you right now." Kimberly nodded, the guilt written all over her face, but she said nothing else. Jason turned and walked out of her apartment, the door closing softly behind him. As he stood in the hallway, Jason's heart was heavy with the weight of the betrayal. He had learned more than he had ever expected to hear, but it only left him with more questions and a deeper pain that didn't seem to have an end. Jason sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. The silence in the house was suffocating. He had spent the last few hours pacing, trying to process everything. The confrontation with Rebecca had left him shaken, but it also gave him clarity. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of her lies. 6 months of deception, of betrayal, and of silent suffering. It was enough. He had given her the benefit of the doubt for too long. But now, as the pieces of their marriage fell apart, Jason was done waiting for her to come to her senses. The sound of the front door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Rebecca walked in, her footsteps hesitant, as if she was unsure of what she would find. Her face was a mask of guilt, but beneath it there was something else, fear. Jason didn't stand up. He didn't need to. He knew what he had to do. "Rebecca," Jason began, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." She flinched but nodded, her eyes not meeting his. She knew this conversation was coming, and yet nothing could have prepared her for it. He took a deep breath, the weight of the words he was about to say pressing heavily on his chest. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living like this. You've lied to me for months. You've betrayed my trust in the worst way possible." Rebecca opened her mouth, but Jason held up a hand to stop her. "No, don't. I've heard enough excuses. I've heard enough about how Tyler made you feel seen, or how I wasn't there for you. That's not what this is about. This is about you choosing someone else over your own husband. Over the life we built together. I can't pretend I don't know what's going on anymore." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but Jason didn't flinch. His heart was hardening with every word he spoke. He had loved her. He had trusted her. But that trust had been shattered, and now he had to find a way to move forward. Without her. "I'm giving you an ultimatum," Jason continued, his voice tight with the restraint it took to keep his emotions in check. "You end things with Tyler, right now, or you leave. You don't get to have both. You don't get to destroy this marriage and still expect me to wait around for you to make up your mind." Rebecca looked up at him, the tears falling freely now. "Jason, please." "Don't," he snapped, his voice breaking slightly despite his best efforts. "Don't beg for forgiveness now. Don't act like this is just some mistake that can be fixed with a few words. This is bigger than that. I need to know that you're willing to fix this, that you still care about us enough to make a choice." For a moment, Rebecca said nothing. She stood there, her face twisted with emotion, her hands trembling at her sides. Jason could see the internal struggle playing out in her eyes. Part of him wanted to believe she was feeling regret, but another part of him knew that even if she was, it might not be enough to fix what had been broken. "I don't know if I can choose," Rebecca finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can let go of him." Jason's stomach tightened. He had been bracing for this, but hearing her say it out loud made the reality even worse. He had given her everything, and this was how she repaid him. The anger, the disappointment, the hurt, they all came rushing back to him in a flood. "Then it's over," he said simply. The words felt final, like a door slamming shut on everything they had once shared. "I can't keep living in a marriage where I'm not enough, where I'm just a placeholder until you figure out who you really want." Rebecca's breath hitched, and she took a tentative step forward, reaching out for him. "Jason, please don't do this. Please don't leave me." Jason shook his head. I'm not leaving you. You've already left me. You just haven't had the decency to tell me the truth until now." There was no more room for negotiation. Jason had reached his breaking point. He wasn't going to beg for something that was no longer there, something that had been taken from him without a second thought. If she couldn't choose him, then she had already chosen to lose him. "Choose, Rebecca," Jason said, his voice low and firm. "You either walk away from him and try to rebuild what we had, or you walk away from everything. I'm done being second best. I'm done with the lies." For a long moment, Rebecca didn't move. The silence between them felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on both of them. Finally, she wiped her eyes and took a step back. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Jason's expression softened slightly, but the decision had already been made. He had no more tears left to shed. He had given her his heart, but now he had to protect it from her. "Then maybe you're not ready to fix it," Jason said quietly, turning toward the door. "And if that's the case, then I'm done waiting. I'm done." With that, he walked out, leaving Rebecca standing there, her heart breaking. But Jason's heart had already been shattered. There was no going back. Jason's phone buzzed, and for a moment he thought it was Rebecca. Maybe a last-ditch apology or a plea for him to reconsider. But when he checked the screen, his stomach turned. It wasn't Rebecca. It was Tyler. The message was brief, almost too casual, as if Tyler didn't even feel the weight of what he had done. It read, "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot tonight. I think it's time we cleared the air." Jason's blood ran cold. The nerve of the man, the arrogance, the entitlement. Tyler knew exactly what he was doing. He was comfortable, confident, and for some reason that made Jason even more furious. Tyler was already taking control of this mess, inserting himself deeper into Jason's life as if nothing had happened, as if there wasn't already enough damage done. Jason debated for a moment, torn between ignoring the message and confronting Tyler head-on. But deep down, he knew he couldn't let this slide. Tyler had to be held accountable. He had to know that Jason wasn't some passive bystander in this mess. So, with one deep breath, Jason typed back, "I'll be there. Don't expect me to back down." It was 9 p.m. when Jason arrived at the parking lot of the small bar Tyler had suggested. The kind of place where the lights were low, the music loud, and the drinks strong. Jason wasn't sure what Tyler was thinking, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a twisted power game. He stepped out of the car, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't know what to expect from Tyler. A confrontation? An apology? Or maybe something worse, an attempt to belittle him, to assert dominance as if nothing had happened. When he walked into the bar, Tyler was already there, leaning casually against the counter, a drink in hand. His easy smile, the one that had been so charming to Rebecca, made Jason's skin crawl now. Tyler had no idea what kind of storm he was about to face. "Jason," Tyler said, greeting him with a nonchalant wave. "Glad you could make it. I figured we could talk man to man." Jason didn't shake his hand. Instead, he stepped forward, his jaw set. "What do you want, Tyler?" Tyler raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Jason's bluntness. "No small talk, huh? All right, let's get straight to it." He took a sip of his drink, leaning back slightly, eyes glinting with an arrogance that made Jason's blood boil. "You've probably got a lot of questions. I get it. But before you do anything rash, hear me out." Jason took a slow breath, his gaze locked onto Tyler's. "Rash? You think this is about me being rash? You're the one who's been sneaking around behind my back for months, playing games with my life. You think you can just waltz in here and make things right? You're delusional." Tyler's smirk didn't falter. "Listen, Jason, I'm not here to rub salt in the wound. I'm not some villain in a movie. I'm just a guy who saw an opportunity and I took it. Rebecca and we've got something. You can call it whatever you want, but it's real." Jason's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The arrogance, the complete disregard for the damage he'd caused, it was maddening. He took a step forward, voice low but intense. "You think this is real? You think you've got a claim to anything here? You're nothing but a coward who thinks he can take whatever he wants without consequences." Tyler's eyes flashed, a flicker of something dangerous there. "You don't get to talk to me like that. I've got just as much right to be with Rebecca as you did. Maybe more. I never lied to her. I never promised her anything I couldn't give. You were the one who failed her. You were the one who made her feel alone." Jason's chest tightened at Tyler's words. He wanted to lash out, to strike the smug look off of his face, but he knew better. He had to stay in control. The truth was, Tyler wasn't entirely wrong. Jason had been distant. He had been busy with work, caught up in the grind. But none of that justified what had happened. It didn't excuse the betrayal, the way Rebecca had thrown everything away for someone who was nothing but an opportunist. Tyler leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, his tone dark. "You know what, Jason? I'm not even sorry. I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm not sorry for taking something that was already broken. If anything, I'm sorry it took you so long to see it." Jason's fists clenched harder, but he remained still. His voice was cold as he spoke, each word laced with fury. "You think this is about you and Rebecca, don't you? You think this is your victory, that you've somehow won. But here's the thing, Tyler, you've lost. Not just her, but everything. You're nothing but a side piece, and I won't let you tear apart my life any more than you already have." Tyler stared at him for a moment, then smirked again, as if Jason's words didn't have the impact he hoped for. "You're pathetic," he muttered under his breath, stepping back from Jason and walking toward the exit. "I guess we're done here, but don't kid yourself. You'll never be rid of me, not while she's still here." Jason watched Tyler leave, his mind spinning with the finality of their conversation. But even as he stood there, the anger still coursing through him, Jason knew one thing for sure: he would not let Tyler win. Not today, not ever. Jason stood in the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of what he was about to do crushing him from the inside out. He had spent weeks, hell, months, denying the truth, putting off what was inevitable. But now there was no avoiding it. He had to face Rebecca. He had to face the woman he loved, the woman who had broken him, and demand the truth. She was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She had been crying a lot lately. Every time Jason had come home, it seemed she was on the verge of breaking down. And who could blame her? But Jason couldn't afford to feel sympathy anymore. Not after everything that had happened. He took a deep breath, stepping into the room. Rebecca looked up, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was a sadness in her gaze, a kind of resignation, as if she knew that this moment was inevitable. She stood slowly, her hands wringing together as she looked at him. "Jason?" she began, but her voice faltered. She didn't know how to begin, didn't know how to fix what was broken between them. Jason didn't let her speak any further. He wasn't interested in words anymore. He needed to hear the truth, the real truth. "I know about everything, Rebecca," he said, his voice cold, controlled. "I know about you and Tyler. I know about the trips, the lies, the months of hiding things from me. I know everything." Her face drained of color, and she looked down at the floor. The weight of his words hit her like a slap. She had never expected him to confront her like this, so direct, so final. I didn't want you to find out this way," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "I was going to tell you, I didn't know how." "Didn't know how?" Jason repeated, his voice rising in frustration. "You didn't know how to tell me that you've been sleeping with someone else for months? That you've been planning to leave me for him?" Rebecca flinched as if his words had struck her physically. She opened her mouth to say something, but Jason was done listening. He had heard enough excuses, enough justifications. 6 months, Rebecca," he continued, his voice cold. 6 months of lies. 6 months of you sneaking around behind my back, and I've been blind to it all. "I'm sorry, Jason," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you." Jason's heart was pounding in his chest, but the pain had transformed into anger. He could feel the heat rising in his veins. How could she stand there and say that? How could she act like everything could just be fixed with a few words? "You're sorry?" Jason asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sorry for what exactly? Sorry you got caught? Sorry you're standing here crying, pretending that you're the victim? You're not sorry, Rebecca. You're sorry you couldn't keep up the lie any longer." The tears fell freely now, her shoulders trembling with each sob. "I never wanted this to happen," she cried, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for things to get so out of control." "But they did," Jason said flatly, his eyes hardening. "And now here we are. You're standing in front of me and you're still trying to justify this, still trying to act like you had no choice." Rebecca shook her head, wiping at her tears. "I didn't want to hurt you," she repeated, as if the words could somehow fix what had been shattered. "I love you, Jason. I always have, but with Tyler, I felt seen. I felt important. You were always working, always busy. I was so alone, and I just found someone who made me feel wanted." Jason felt his throat tighten as her words cut through him, but he didn't show it. He couldn't. He had to be strong. He had to protect himself from her because right now he was the only person who could. "You think that's an excuse?" Jason's voice was low, but it was full of rage. "You think he made you feel wanted? What about me? What about the years we spent together? You just threw all that away because you were lonely?" Rebecca's face crumpled, her sobs increasing as the weight of his words hit her fully. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jason took a step back, his face a mask of sorrow. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Rebecca. I don't know if I can even look at you the same way anymore." Rebecca fell to her knees in front of him, tears falling freely now, her hands outstretched as if begging for something, anything to fix this. "Please, Jason, please, I'm sorry. I will do anything to make it right." Jason closed his eyes, the pain becoming unbearable. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, was now reduced to this, begging him for forgiveness when she knew there was no fixing what she had done. He took another step back, his voice steady but final. "It's too late for that, Rebecca. You've made your choice, and now so have I." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then, with the weight of the decision settling over him like a blanket, Jason walked away. He didn't look back. Jason stood in the hallway staring at the front door. His hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something heavier, more suffocating. It was the weight of the decision he had just made. The lock, the key, the act itself. It was simple. Yet in this moment it felt like the most monumental thing he had ever done in his life. The key in his hand was cold, as if the door itself was rejecting the change. He had always been the one to fix things, to make sure they stayed together. But that was before. Before Rebecca's betrayal, before Tyler, before the lies. He had tried to fix things, to hope it would work out. But now, Jason realized, this was his way of finally ending it. This was his way of taking back control of his life. With a deep breath, he inserted the new key into the lock. The click sounded too loud in the silence, reverberating through his mind. Jason turned the key, then pushed the door open, hearing the faint sound of the door frame shifting under the pressure. It was the sound of finality, the sound of something that would never be the same again. Rebecca had left that morning for work, leaving Jason alone in the house. But he knew it wasn't just any ordinary morning. He could feel the difference. He had already packed most of his things, what little he had left that mattered, and now, with the lock changed, the final piece had fallen into place. He walked through the house slowly, as if trying to remember how things used to be. The familiar smell of coffee, the warmth of the sunlight through the windows, the hum of the refrigerator in the background. It was all still there. But it didn't feel like home anymore. Not to him. He had given Rebecca everything, his trust, his loyalty, his love. But in return, she had given him nothing but lies. He had built a life with her, and now all of that was slipping through his fingers like sand. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb, a place that would always remind him of what had been taken from him. Jason stopped in front of the bedroom door, the door that had once held so many memories. But now, it was just another door, another barrier between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He opened it and stepped inside. Everything was as it had been, except for the emptiness. The bed was still made, the pillows fluffed, the closet full of her things. But it was all just stuff now, things that no longer mattered. He glanced at the dresser where a framed picture of their wedding day still stood, the smiling faces of the couple that had once been so in love. He didn't recognize them anymore. They were strangers, lost in time. The woman in that picture had betrayed him. The man beside her had been deceived. And now, all that was left was the shattered image of their life together. Jason picked up the picture and stared at it for a long time. He felt a bitter twist in his chest, a mixture of anger, grief, and regret. He wanted to throw it across the room, to shatter the image just like his heart had been shattered. But instead, he set it down gently on the dresser. It was over. Jason turned and walked out of the room, moving toward the front door. He had to do this now. He couldn't wait any longer. The house felt even emptier now that he had made the change. He couldn't bring himself to face her again, not with all the lies still hanging in the air between them. He had to leave before he completely lost himself in the pain. The lock clicked again as he opened the door to leave. But this time he wasn't just leaving the house. He was leaving behind everything that came with it, the lies, the hurt, the memories. He stepped outside into the cold, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that shook him to the core. The house, their life, their marriage, it was all in the past now. And no matter how much it hurt, Jason knew it was the only way forward. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going back. Jason had spent the last few days in a daze, processing the finality of what had happened, the lock change, the last confrontation. Walking away from the house had been painful, but necessary. Now, as he stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe, he couldn't help but feel a slight sense of relief, even though he had no idea where to go from here. But then his phone buzzed again, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he hadn't expected, David, a colleague who had been on the same project as Tyler. Jason hesitated but answered the call. "Hey, man." David's voice came through the line, sounding unusually serious. "I don't know how to say this, but I thought you should know something about Tyler." Jason's chest tightened. "What's going on?" "There's been a lot of whispers about him at work. Seems like the guy's been hiding something big. I didn't want to get involved, but I think you should know. Tyler's been messing around with company funds. There's an audit coming up and it's not looking good for him." Jason's mind raced. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The man who had torn his life apart was now on the verge of losing everything? Part of him wanted to feel vindicated, but another part, something deeper, something more human, felt nothing but emptiness. David continued, unaware of the storm brewing in Jason's mind. "I thought you should hear it from me before it hits the fan. It's a mess. I don't know how long he can keep this up, but the higher-ups are getting suspicious. They'll find out soon enough." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. He didn't know whether to be relieved or to feel sick to his stomach. "Thanks for telling me," Jason replied, his voice low, barely above a whisper. He ended the call and stood there, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Tyler had been living on borrowed time. His professional world was now crumbling just as his personal life had. Jason wasn't sure what he wanted from this, whether he sought revenge, or if he was just relieved to know that Tyler would face some kind of consequence. But the truth was undeniable. Tyler had manipulated, lied, and taken everything he could from Jason, and now the world was closing in on him. Jason's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't David. It was Rebecca. He stared at her name for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. What could she possibly want now? She had already shattered everything he held dear, and now she was calling again, as if everything could be fixed. He ignored the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't ready to deal with her again, not today, not when he had just uncovered the magnitude of Tyler's downfall. Jason's thoughts were interrupted as he caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. It was Tyler. Walking briskly, his face set in a determined expression. Jason's heart quickened. For a brief moment, he wondered if Tyler had somehow known about the phone call, if he'd somehow realized that his world was about to collapse. But there was no time for that. Jason crossed the street quickly, his mind made up. He couldn't let this moment slip by. Tyler needed to know that he couldn't keep going without facing the consequences. Tyler turned to face him as he approached, his confident smile fading as he saw Jason standing there. The air between them crackled with tension. "Jason," Tyler said, his voice full of false charm. "What's up?" Jason's voice was calm, but his words hit hard. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, Tyler? You think you can do whatever you want, hurt whoever you want, and walk away with no consequences." Tyler's smirk faltered, and he took a step back, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of Jason's gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jason stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "I know everything. I know about your little game with the company funds. I know about your lies, your arrogance. It's all falling apart, Tyler, just like everything else in your life." Tyler's face turned pale. For a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Then his bravado returned, but it was weak, tinged with panic. "You don't have proof. You can't do anything." Jason's lips curled into a cold smile. "You're right, but the people who matter do, and they'll find out soon enough. I'm not the one you should be worried about, Tyler. It's the people you've been lying to for months. They're coming for you." Tyler took a step back, his eyes darting nervously. "You're lying. You don't know anything." But Jason could see the fear in his eyes. The facade was cracking, and Tyler knew it. His downfall was inevitable, and Jason could sense it. The company, the people he had manipulated, it was all unraveling, just as his relationship with Rebecca had. Jason stood there for a moment, watching the man who had destroyed so much of his life, realizing that it wasn't just Rebecca who had betrayed him. It was Tyler, too, using his charm and lies to crawl into the life that Jason had worked so hard to build. "You're finished, Tyler," Jason said quietly, his voice unwavering. "It's over." Tyler didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his impending fall hanging over him. Jason watched him go, his heart still heavy with everything that had happened, but knowing that this chapter was finally closing. Jason hadn't realized how much his life had been consumed by the storm of betrayal until he found himself sitting alone in the dimly lit apartment. The familiar hum of the city outside, the low sounds of traffic and people, it all felt like it was happening in a distant world. A world where nothing made sense anymore. He had changed the locks. He had faced Rebecca. He had confronted Tyler. But even after all of that, the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on him like a vice. He could feel it in his chest, a dull ache that never seemed to go away. He tried to distract himself. He tried to throw himself into work, into anything that might give him a sense of normalcy again. But nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rebecca's face, saw the tear-streaked expression that told him everything he needed to know. She was sorry, yes, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Jason looked at his phone, still untouched by any messages. The silence was deafening, especially now that Rebecca had tried to reach out to him a few times, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. What was there left to say? What could she say that would make any difference? His hand trembled slightly as he set the phone back down on the table. There was a heaviness to the air in the apartment, something he couldn't shake off no matter how much he tried to breathe through it. It was the weight of disappointment, the weight of a life that had been shattered and a trust that had been irreparably broken. Jason closed his eyes for a moment, rubbing his temples. The memories of their time together were still vivid, moments of laughter, shared goals, quiet nights in front of the TV, the things that had once made their life so rich, so full. But now they were tainted. Every shared memory felt like a lie. Every smile, every kiss felt like it had been built on a foundation of false promises. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound felt too loud in the silence. Jason walked to the window, looking out over the city. It was strange, really. All these people living their lives, going through their days, and yet here he was, struggling to piece his life back together after everything that had fallen apart. The anger, the hurt, it was all still there, but now it was mixed with something deeper, a kind of numbness. He had spent so much time focusing on the betrayal, the anger, the justification for everything that had happened. But now that it was all over, he felt empty, hollow. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on the structure of his marriage to give him a sense of purpose, and now that it was gone, he was left wondering what was left for him. What did his life even look like now? There was a knock at the door. It startled him, and for a moment Jason hesitated, wondering if he should even answer. But he knew who it was. It had to be her. He stood still for a moment longer, gathering the fragments of his resolve before walking to the door. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the handle, the familiar sensation of dread settling in his chest. When he opened the door, there she was, Rebecca. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her posture hunched as if the weight of the past few days was too much for her to carry. She looked like a shadow of the woman he had once known. "Jason," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I know you don't want to see me right now, but please, can we talk?" Jason didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could stomach another conversation with her. He didn't know if he had the strength to listen to more apologies, more explanations, more excuses. But she was standing there, looking at him with so much vulnerability that he felt his resolve begin to crack. He stepped aside, letting her in, but not without a sense of finality. There was no going back from this. There was no fixing this. Not now. Not ever. They stood in the living room for a long moment in silence. Rebecca didn't speak at first, as if she was giving Jason time to process her presence. Her eyes searched his face for something, anything, to tell her that he still cared, still loved her. But Jason knew that wasn't going to happen. He had reached his limit. "I don't know what you want from me, Rebecca," Jason said, his voice low and steady. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel anymore. I don't know if I even care about what you have to say." Rebecca flinched, the words hitting her harder than any physical blow could. She took a step back, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But she didn't cry this time. She had no more tears left. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything, for the lies, for the pain. I never wanted to hurt you, Jason. You were the most important thing in my life." Jason closed his eyes, his chest tightening as he tried to push the wave of emotion back down. "You don't get to say that now," he replied quietly. "You've already hurt me. You've already broken everything. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I don't even know if I want to." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo the damage. Jason could feel it in his bones. The relationship, the life they had built, was over, and so was the man he once was. Jason had been staring at his phone for what felt like hours. The screen was blank, but his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had gone through every possible scenario, every possible word he could say, but none of them seemed to fit. Nothing seemed to be enough. And now, after everything, he was staring at the single message from Rebecca that he hadn't responded to. "Jason, I'm sorry. I need to see you one last time. Please, let's talk." The words felt like a weight in his chest, pulling him down. He had already made his decision. He wasn't going to go back. There was no coming back from the lies, the betrayal, the months of deceit. But the message, it lingered. It felt like an anchor, pulling him back to a place he didn't want to visit again. He could hear her voice in his head, the quiet desperation, the pleading. She had been sorry before, said she would do anything to make it right. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, the hurt that had been done. He wasn't sure what more she could say that would change anything, and yet something gnawed at him, the finality of it. This was it, the last chapter. Whatever closure he was going to get, it would come from this one final conversation. And as much as he wanted to shut her out completely, he couldn't. He wasn't ready to be that cold. Maybe that was his flaw. Maybe it was his mistake. Jason took a deep breath, unlocked his phone, and began typing. "I'll meet you, but this is the last time." He hit send before he could think twice about it. Then he put the phone down, looking out the window of the small apartment he had moved into. The city lights seemed distant, out of reach like everything else. The apartment felt too small, too empty. But it was his now. No one else's. No more reminders of the past, no more shared spaces. It was a new start, something he didn't know if he was ready for, but he had no other choice. He'd moved on physically, but emotionally he was still trapped. There were days when he thought he might forgive Rebecca, when the rawness of the betrayal might fade enough for him to see the woman he had once loved. But those thoughts didn't last. They couldn't, because every time he tried to imagine forgiveness, the memory of the lies and the deceit came rushing back, drowning out any trace of sympathy. Jason stood up, grabbed his jacket, and left the apartment without another word. He wasn't sure where the meeting would take them, or what kind of closure, if any, he would find. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her walk back into his life and destroy whatever remnants of peace he had left. The coffee shop where they had agreed to meet was quiet, empty for the most part. It was an old place, one they had visited years ago when things between them were still easy. They used to sit here for hours, talking about nothing and everything, but now it was just a cold backdrop to the end of something that had once been real. Jason arrived early, the chill of the evening air still on his skin, his nerves tight with anticipation. He didn't want to feel anything for her anymore. He couldn't, but part of him still hoped for something, an apology that meant something, maybe even the words he had always wanted to hear from her, that she regretted everything, that she was sorry from the depths of her soul. Minutes passed, and the door to the coffee shop chimed softly. Jason's gaze immediately snapped to it, but it wasn't Rebecca at first. It was a stranger. He looked back down at his phone. Another minute, maybe two. He could leave. He could walk out the door and never look back. But something held him in place. Finally, the door opened again, and this time, it was her. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes scanning the room before they landed on him. Rebecca's face was a picture of exhaustion, her eyes dull, a tired sadness hanging over her like a veil. Jason's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let himself move. He wouldn't. He had already made his decision, already prepared for this moment. Rebecca walked over slowly, her steps heavy. She sat down across from him, the space between them feeling like miles. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, the silence settling over them, thick and heavy. "I never wanted it to end this way," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Jason's eyes locked with hers, but there was no anger left in him, only an overwhelming sense of finality. He had heard her say it so many times before, but it never meant anything. The words felt hollow. "You've said that before," Jason said quietly, "and it doesn't change anything." She reached across the table, her hand hovering near his. "Please, Jason, I know I made mistakes, but I still love you. I always will." He stared at her hand for a long moment, but he didn't reach for it. There was nothing left between them now. Not love, not trust. "I think it's time we both let go," Jason said, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. "There's nothing left to fix. It's over." Rebecca pulled her hand back, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't say anything more. She knew. They both did. Jason stood up, his heart heavy but resolute. He walked out of the coffee shop without another glance, leaving behind the woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him. And in that moment, as he walked away from the past, he finally felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Jason's new apartment felt different. The air was still, quieter than he was used to, but there was something about it that made him feel free. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the city skyline. The world outside was bustling, full of life, but inside he was finally alone. It was a strange sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months, maybe even years. Everything had changed. The life he once knew, the life he had worked so hard to build with Rebecca, was no longer there. And for the first time, Jason allowed himself to accept that. He wasn't going to go back. He wasn't going to live in the past. He had to keep moving forward. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, scrolling absent-mindedly through old messages, old photos, memories of a life he was no longer part of. He stopped on a picture from their last vacation together, a time when everything had seemed perfect, when they were still happy. Jason stared at the image for a long time, but instead of the pain he had expected, there was just emptiness. He didn't feel anger anymore. He didn't feel rage, just a numb kind of acceptance. The life they had once shared was gone, and the future was still uncertain. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep letting the past define him. He had to reclaim himself, his life, his future. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He stood up, walking across the room. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see his colleague David standing there, a somewhat hesitant smile on his face. "Hey, man," David said, stepping inside without waiting for a reply. "Thought I'd check in. Haven't heard from you in a while." Jason managed a small smile. "I've been adjusting?" David nodded, as if he understood more than Jason had said. "I get it. Look, I know things have been rough with everything, but you've got to start taking care of yourself, man. Work's been piling up. I need you back at the office." Jason felt a pang of discomfort. He wasn't sure if he was ready to jump back into the hustle of work. Not yet. But David was right. There was a part of him that wanted to return to something normal, something that made sense. He nodded slowly, trying to push aside the remnants of his exhaustion. "Yeah, you're right," Jason said. "I'll be there tomorrow." David grinned. "Good. We've got a big project and I could use your head in the game." Jason forced a smile. "I'll bring it. Thanks for stopping by, David." As David left, Jason closed the door behind him, his mind buzzing with the weight of the decision. He wasn't ready to jump back into his old life, not entirely, but he couldn't keep wallowing in the past either. It was time to face forward, even if the path was unclear. The next morning, Jason walked into the office feeling the familiar weight of the place. He hadn't realized how much he missed the routine, the structure. It was a small comfort in a world that had felt upside down for so long. He moved through the workday mechanically, checking emails, responding to messages, doing what needed to be done. His colleagues spoke to him like everything was normal, and for a moment, Jason let himself believe it. Maybe things could be normal again? But in the back of his mind, there was still that empty space, the void that couldn't be filled. It wasn't something that would go away overnight, and maybe it never would. He couldn't erase what had happened. He couldn't pretend it hadn't broken him, but he didn't need to forget it either. He just had to move forward. Later that evening, after work, Jason sat in his apartment again, a small sense of peace settling in his chest. The phone buzzed again. Rebecca. He had ignored her messages for days now, but this one was different. It wasn't just an apology or a plea for him to come back. It was a goodbye. "I know you don't want to hear from me again, and I don't expect you to. But I want you to know that I'm sorry, Jason, for everything. I'll always love you. I'll never forget what we had." The message was simple, yet the weight of it hit him harder than any apology she had given. He stared at the screen for a long time, his heart heavy with a mix of emotions. But this time, it didn't hurt. The words didn't have the same sting they once would have. They just felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Someone from a life that wasn't his anymore. Jason deleted the message and set his phone down. He felt no rush to respond, no urge to fight for what was lost. He had already made his peace. He didn't need closure from Rebecca anymore. He had learned to give it to himself. As the night settled around him, Jason felt a small sense of hope creeping back into his life. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. He was no longer afraid to move forward. The road ahead was his to walk, and this time he was going to walk it on his own terms.